We've been missing you. Do you want to find the witch friends you've been missing? Do you want to participate in these conversations live? And do you want to support the work of recovering a true history of feminist ideas about magic? Do you want to hang out? Do you want an invite to Zoom together with Amy and myself every new moon, along with our hilarious, diverse, wise, queer, creative, anti-racist, science, and awe-loving coven? You must join the Missing Witches Patreon. It's pay what you can, and we can't wait to meet you there. Patreon.com/missingwitches.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch.
Be a witch. Be a witch. Be a witch. Be a witch. Be a witch. Be a witch.
You must be a witch.
We've been so excited by our first forays into having members of our community and our circle participate in these conversations. So for witches who are listening, collaborators who are listening, folks who are floating in and out, please feel free to speak up. It's nicer together. And I will say, welcome, practitioners of all kinds, word witches, artists, strangers in the woods, mitochondria, lichen, rainbow trout, whoever happens to be on the line today, welcome. We're really glad you're here. If you are a listener to this podcast, then you may know or suspect we've had a guideline for ourselves from the beginning about prioritizing the voices and ideas and histories in our storytelling and in our interviews of women and of people of marginalized genders, because those are the ideas most violently missing from pretty much all discourses and from my life and heart, and Amy's, and those were the things we went researching. But all rules for me are meant to be leaned against and bent, and all lines curve. And so today we make our first exception. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, we like to play with things. And two, I started reading this person's poetry. I can see Jarod's face, so I'm not going to pretend I'm not talking about him. I felt there was a writing there about magic, like a willingness to engage with that idea in the way that I like to play with it, that connected to the thing that I know and need about the natural world that makes me feel sometimes like things will be okay. And I just recognized a friend that I wanted to talk to, and that is like enough of an impulse for me. And then also, we'd had conversations in the podcast and in our coven circle and with our friends about how Amy and I both mention in our book that we had found these good men and moved to the woods and started to build a magical kind of life. And people said, that good man magic seems kind of hard to find, tell us a bit more about that. And so my desire to lean against this rule a little bit occasionally is also a kind of love note to a kind of masculinity that I know has stood alongside women and people of marginalized genders from the beginning, and that I want to identify and speak to and speak about. And those are the things I've been thinking about tending the fire today, getting ready for this interview. It's a bit of a long intro, but we have Jarod Canderson here today, the Cryptonaturalist, co-creator of the podcast, poet, author, someone who is incredibly generous with sharing his words on the internet and connecting with communities in that way. And I'm just really excited you're here. Hi, thanks for coming.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's so lovely to be here.
Yeah.
I meant to ask you before. You invited me on the podcast, and I was thrilled to do it, but I hadn't really spoken to you about where you encountered my work before.
Yeah, I'm an internet follower. I've been like someone who's like worked in web and social media for a really long time, since before creating the podcast and during. And so I'd seen and like bookmarked and shared Cryptonaturalist things without really realizing, without even imagining the person behind them, just being like, fuck yes, the universe.
It's funny, your point about masculinity. I early in I've been posting poetry on the internet for a few years, and early on and still, anytime I post any picture of myself, I get at least half a dozen people saying, "Oh, I thought you were a woman."
Really?
And I was like, "Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
It's nice." But yeah, I tend to get that a lot, which is interesting. It says interesting things about mainstream masculinity, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. How do you feel about that? I mean, also, how do you feel about being our first exemption?
I'm honored. I didn't know that. I listened back to a few of your episodes, but I didn't notice.
Yeah.
How do I feel about it? Yeah, my feelings about masculinity have been an interesting thing over my entire lifetime. I've walked some interesting lines with it. I remember winning a statewide poetry contest when I was in middle school and having to miss football practice for it. And you can imagine the sort of response that I got for that sort of pursuit. And I came from sort of a semi-rural Rust Belt sort of traditional upbringing of sort of masculinity linked to violence. And so I've been grappling with that for a long time, of how to think about it, and I don't know how to perform masculinity if I want to.
Right.
I think largely in my creative work and just sort of my own evolving philosophical identity, I've sort of tried to get out of my own way about it. Like, I try to sort of listen to the quiet voice within myself and try to shrug off. I'm not so deluded as to think that I'm untouched by the context in which I was raised. But yeah, I often think of things like, and in my work, I try, when I'm talking to men, to try to redefine strength and toughness and what it means and how it can be linked to compassion, because I'm always talking about sort of the relativity of those sort of terms. Strong compared to what? Tough compared to what? Like these can be virtues in themselves, virtues that men certainly don't own. But the problem isn't extolling strength as a virtue. The problem is when it becomes sort of worshipful. I think a lot of modern masculinity gets to the point where they are worshiping the idea of strength to the point where they think they hate weakness. And if you worship the idea of strength, I think you will always feel weak, because you're not. I mean, we're fragile biological beings. And so, the premise becomes that if you worship strength, there's always a secret voice in you that says, well, you're broken, you're not strong enough, and then that's just not a good foundation to build an identity on, to build a life on. So yeah, I wish I could have more of a hand in sort of redefining what masculinity is. I certainly try through my work. Yeah, I think about masculinity a lot. I think about it. I'm not sure what to do with it a lot of the time, but yeah, these issues come up again and again.
Yeah. You use the word worship, which I think about a lot. I mean, I'm like an atheist, universe loving witch who talks to my lake, or like I don't have that
Sure.
that figured out,
Yeah.
but I don't know that there's much that I worship. Do you think you
Yeah.
worship anything now that you've sort of shaken out of that idea of strength?
I'm uncomfortable with that word in a strange way.
Yeah, me
Maybe
too.
because I was raised by atheists, and strangely enough, I did a master's degree in Renaissance English, so I had to suddenly come to the Bible and learn Latin, and I told somebody, I was on a podcast called Existential Happy Hour, speaking to somebody who came from an evangelical background and was now a deconstructionist, was redefining it and pushing back. And I told him, when I came to the Bible, I could sort of say, oh, neat stories,
Right,
and he's
right.
like, yeah, he's like, yeah, for me, it's an open wound. I can't find it neat. It's like, oh yeah, I understand. I respect that. But still, the idea of worship to me has connotations of like unexamined love, sort of in a way that it feels like maybe orthodoxy is the word, like hardline, unexamined love, or love doesn't sound like the right word, sort of buying into something so completely you're not allowed to talk to it anymore.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to question it. I think the closest thing I have is I think if I have anything that's analogous, it's that I like to feel sort of a often directionless gratitude for nature and the natural world. But whereas worship feels like a one-way street, I think sort of the gratitude that I like to feel when I come to nature is much more of a dialogue. I feel like it's much more of a give and take, an actual relationship, not praising something distant and untouchable. It's something intimate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. And it also makes me feel validated. All of the questions I wrote when I was trying to think about questions to ask you had the word relationship in them. Like, what's your relationship with masculinity? What's your relationship with the natural world? So I'm glad to hear that is a way that you sort of think about things.
Yeah. That's how I think about most things, because if it is a relationship, if you take sort of the if you take on kind of the ideological burden with the idea that like most of these philosophical ideas we interact with is, meaning happens in collaboration between you, your identity, where you are now, what your values are at the moment, and then all of these external forces in the world, then like something in between those two tensions is where I think meaning happens. So yeah, it's a relationship. I think it's always a relationship.
Yeah, I think so too. This feels like the right time to ask if you would read a poem.
Sure. Yeah. Would you like me to read Candle Facts?
Yeah, I would. I'd like you to read all of them, but let's read Candle Facts 1 and then talk about
Okay.
fire.
I'll read as many as you like. I know you said you had a few.
Yeah, I got a list.
All right, sounds good. Candle Facts number 1. If you whisper a secret to a candle flame, then all fire everywhere will know that secret. The words will crackle in every campfire and churn like an ocean deep in the belly of the earth. Fire will translate your words to smoke and ash, telling no one but the sky.
It's so funny. Like I read that just recently, and I had been, I sit and like my partner and I like tend the fire all day in this part of the year. So I was having like this very visceral moment of like looking at the fire and feeling, and right before I read your poem and feeling like this fire is all the fires, like this life is all the lives, this instant is all the instants. They're unique and then they're everything. And that felt like suddenly very true. And then like whacked my head against that poem.
I've always sort of thought of candles as sort of a great embodiment of that idea that like I'm looking at a piece of a whole of sort of a natural phenomenon, that this is an individual shard of that huge incalculable whole, and then you can spin from that onto yourself as being sort of a candle flame of the larger inferno of life. So I think there's a reason that candles show up so much in all sorts of magical and religious practices.
Yeah, I think so too. Do you what's your relationship with the idea of magic?
So nothing organized, I will say. I was talking to my partner about it. Coming on this podcast, I thought, I should probably have this conversation, kind of articulate these sorts of questions for myself, because, and she pointed out like that I do things that I consider magic sometimes, and ritual and spells, but they're always things that I kind of have come up with in order to take an abstract thought, something sort of fleeting or incorporeal, or a hope or an intention, and then if it kind of works the same. That really parallels with poetry and writing. If I want that thought, that intention to take on more weight than something that might fleet through my mind, then I think ritual is often the way to do that. And so, I've done things, writing things on leaves and burying them. I've done burning certain things in certain ways, certain objects, gathering things. I've done just writing the same phrase over and over again for a week and carrying it with me. Things like that, where it's like you build up kind of inertia with an intention. And I think there's so much tremendous mystery and magic in the universe that I've always felt sort of called to participate in it, but in a way that's always been sort of private, because I've always felt like, well, it's about me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, full body nod. I know exactly what you're talking about. I think most of the witches, and I mean, we play with the word witch, right? Mostly because we were, women or queer people or marginalized people who felt like we weren't drawn to the princess, so we were probably the fucking witch. We were outsiders wherever we were, or we related to those stories. But I mean, Amy and myself, I'll at least, I can refer to our own experiences, and I think people in our community and our listener base have a wide variety, but I mean the same. Like we're not Wiccans. We didn't really feel attached to a lot of these branches of the spiritual new age. Like there's a lot of racism that can lurk in there, appropriation, and we were really interested in stories of a history of ideas that had been excluded, to try to understand our own impulse. It was so much like yours. It was just like, we got together and sang and wrote things on candles and invented our own rituals and had always done it. So then we just started doing it together.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah. There have been people before that have talked to me about like, oh, you're like a druid. And I'm like, I'm not really comfortable with that term. Like I don't need it.
If that's for you, but that's not for me.
I don't know. But I think we've been in sort of a project of building found family a lot over the last few years. So I have a 2-year-old with my partner, and several of our friends have kids, and we're all fun oddballs. And so we're all kind of like, I want traditions, but we don't necessarily want or necessarily want any of this kind of prepackaged traditions. It's like, so we've been sort of engaging in this, like giving ourselves permission to make our own sort of traditions, whatever they may be, and kind of considering the importance of ritual togetherness as a good in itself, which, I think it's the same for sort of group meaning, and it's the same for individual meaning, that a lot of I think a lot of healing comes when you start to give yourself permission to take the meaning you make seriously, rather in your own mind, or sort of together in togetherness rituals.
I think that for most of us, we are drawn to that ritual space from pain, I think, from trauma, from healing, from like not having a set of rituals that we can go to anymore. So we make them up. Yeah. Can we talk about mental health?
Sure. Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, just like, what's your relationship with mental health? No,
I've had lifelong sort of brutal chronic depression, and if anybody reads a lot of my poetry, they'll see a haunted house metaphor come up a lot for the mind. And I'll say I'm doing better than I ever have before. And a lot of it has come from sort of, I think I wrote a poem about this. Can I find a poem?
Yeah. And while you pull it up, can I say, I had read a lot of your poetry and your work online, and then I was digging through your website and I found a blog post you'd written like relatively recently, like a letter to yourself.
Oh yeah.
And I sent it to like a family member who struggles with depression, who was like one of the people I love most in the world, and I'm like terrified by the way this thing haunts her, and there's a bit in it about magic words, which I love.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I'm some writers remember their writing so well, and I am not one of those people. Like, I get it onto paper, and then, like, if I read it again a year later, I'm like, oh, this person has some good points. um, so like, I know the letter you mean, but I
Yeah,
and
so
I remember that the kernel of it for me was saying that, like, stop adding shame on top of the burden
yeah.
of this thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you have a piece in it where, and I can paraphrase it at will because you don't remember it, but where you said, how you talk about magic words, you say that that words are magic, that everyone knows this in some way, which is something, as a writer and a child of writers, whatever, I think about all the time. Like, we've called all of this world into being with the power of words. For the most part, we convince each other of things and share people's ideas, and that you give this super concrete example of that you've been like a weightlifter at times in your life, and then you realize that you have more strength in your body if you count to 5 twice than if you count to 10 once.
I did that earlier today. Yeah, it's still true. It's yeah, somehow 8 sends a signal to your brain that, like, it's time for this to get too hard to do. Whereas if you try to count to 5 twice, it works. And it's just like the ways in which the mind can really exert change over reality are so myriad and mysterious and fascinating, and trying to find ways to poke and prod at that and experiment with it. I feel like language is the tool to do that with. I have another example recently. I just finished a novel. And so for myself, I always have to gamify big projects. Not just gamify, I have to write them down. So I have to write on the calendar every day. And for a while, I was putting a check mark when I got my word count, and that wasn't doing it for me. And so I started to write things like victory, exclamation point, stuff. And that changed it. That changed the tone of it. Like, okay, this is really a thing to celebrate, not a check mark. It's like, okay, if I celebrate myself rather than acting like I'm, punching a card or something, that it really changed. It changed my whole day. And so, yeah, thinking about how you talk to yourself is such a big part of how you face depression and mental health too. I have this poem here. So this one came sort of from people talking to me about because a lot of followers of my work know that I struggle with depression and know sort of my overwhelming love of nature, and often ask how those things fit together. This one's called The Treatment. I can't say spending time in nature heals depression. For me, the outdoors changes sadness from a pain to be endured to a state to be experienced. It's still sadness, but in the context of green growing things, under a limitless sky, sadness is simplified, not a wound, a tile in the mosaic. Even so, depression needs more. I resisted trying therapy for a long time because I thought I was too smart for it. Here's the thing. You can't think your way out of depression any more than you can think your way out of drowning. Asking for a life jacket is more important than knowing the physics of buoyancy. And so, I go to nature a lot as sort of a way to soothe sadness and depression, and it works. But I never want to tell people, oh, it's magic. And if you just go put your palm against a living tree, you'll feel all of it. It doesn't work that way. But what it does is it changes your context. If you're sitting in a square beige room, and then you go outside and remember what the world is and the universe is and nature and what you're a part of, that changes sort of the power and the menace of mental health problems. But yeah, I didn't start really making strides until I embraced some humility and started going to other experts and letting them in a real and honest way.
And do you think that changed your writing? Like, does it change who you're talking to, or how you talk to them, that you had this sort of opening or this outside perspective?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so finding a therapist for me, it's hard. I think I went through 5. I remember one person told me that maybe I just needed to be sad because I'm a writer, and that's good for art. And, oh, fuck you.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
There's a lot of
And
bad
then,
therapists out there.
oh yeah. And then I found a guy I really liked, and I brought my partner in on a session to sit with me, and sort of, because I trust her opinion, and I don't trust my own opinion on matters of the brain sometimes. And she was just like, where did you find this guy? He's perfect for you. I mean, he was this sort of long gray hair guy that like makes his own maple syrup and lives out in the woods, and he kind of, that's his like she's like, it's like you drew this guy and he came to life. But the point being, you got to kind of find, in terms of therapy, it's so important to find somebody that you feel like you connect with, and that their sort of sense of the world echoes yours a little bit, especially if we're talking about, cognitive behavioral therapy, where what you're doing is sort of talking to your own thoughts and recognizing them and interrogating them. But yeah, it's hard work. It's a lot easier if you have a support system that is kind of nudging you along, but it's work.
I feel like a lot of the time when I read your poems, I mean, they're almost all addressed in the second person, like you're calling out to somebody or to everybody. Do you picture, is it all for your partner? Is it you? Is it a great internet mass of friends?
I think it's me, to a certain extent, but it has changed a little bit. So I only sort of jumped on broadcasting my thoughts sort of publicly a few years ago, rather than writing poetry and leaving them in my own journal. And I've got like 90,000 followers across social media now.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but some of the things you write, like you'll see just suddenly everywhere. Like people are just like, this is the thing I needed. And on your Facebook, almost every response is, I needed to hear this today. I needed to hear this today. I needed to hear this today. Yeah.
And I only bring it up to say that like it changes it a little bit now, where it feels like there's almost a service component to it, where I feel like, where I sort of sit and I publish stuff most days and I often sit and think like, what is eating at me and what can I say back to it? And maybe I can articulate it in a way, since I have sort of a lifelong study of words, and how can I use that skill, bring to bear, to help other people who maybe don't have the response to talk back to certain anxieties, or that maybe don't know how to articulate in their own mind how to feel sort of a swelling of hope about their own connection to the natural world. Because I've seen so many people who are so wounded by early exposure to different theologies, and I see people move through the like, I'm wounded, to the recoiling, to the sort of isolation, and then I guess I want to reach out to some of those people and say, like, it doesn't have to be that or nothing.
One of the ones I read that hit home for me like that, and then I felt that you were both saying it to yourself as like a kind of cognitive behavior therapy style, and to listeners. Like, it really reads like that. It's naming the river. The water in your body is just visiting. It was a thunderstorm a week ago. It'll be an ocean soon enough. Most of your cells come and go like morning dew. We are more weather pattern than stone monument. Sunlight on mist, summer lightning. Your choices outweigh your substance. I mean, that I sat with that for a really long time. We are more weather pattern than stone monument.
Yeah. I mean, it almost goes back to the candle flame, right? Like in my mind, at any given moment, you could take an individual person and sort of view them as an instance of nature, sort of an awakening of nature, not necessarily kind of an unchanging landmark, but a personification in a very literal way. And, it can be more complicated than that, but remembering that the forces that made the mountains, and the processes that brought the leaf into the world are exactly the same that came to bear to get us here having this conversation. I think that is both true, and I think it's worth pondering in a way that sort of changes our relationship to the world, especially for people who feel kind of a vacuum of spirituality. You know, I see people. I have sort of different genres of fans sometimes, and I see sort of the hardcore science people, and then I see sort of the I love magic people, and sometimes I see sort of a clash between them, and it's just like, I feel like you're both holding half an amulet here, and you need to
Right.
you need to put them together. But you know, where I then feel a duty is, it's like, all right, so okay, you know, lover of words, figure out how to do that. Figure out how to help these people find their common ground.
Yeah. The violence of that binary is something we talk about a lot, and with a lot of the witches we talk about, talk to and talk about, people we research. Can you dig out and read the poem called "The Chain" if you're taking requests?
Oh, sure. I'll take requests. Put $1 in my guitar case.
Yeah. This is a good time to mention that Jarod and the Cryptonaturalist have a lovely Patreon that we encourage you to join and support.
Well, thank you. Jarod needs to put an index in his poetry book next time. Okay, here it is. The Chain. You were once very much part of your mother's body. The same is true for your mother and her mother, and so on back to the beginning. It's a biological chain that stretches back to the first living cell awakening in a young ocean, millions of years before the first spoken name. We are links in that chain. Can you feel its weight? A clear path back to ancient waters. You are here, in modernity, as familiar as thirst. Just remember what else you are. Your mother, her mother, the ancient seas beneath a thin new sky.
I'm very thankful that poem exists and that it goes out to an audience that includes, I think, lonely men who struggle with the concepts of masculinity that we were talking about earlier. And I think it's nice on your podcast, we hear your old cowboy voice. Sometimes we hear like a strong version of masculinity that wants to remind. I mean, there's a mental health crisis among men. There's a suicide crisis among men in Canada. I think it's the same in the United States. And it's totally haunting. You know, we have a rising rate of murders of women in Canada and the United States, but also like looming large over that is the men who just kill each other. And there's just such a crisis and culture of violence that I'm glad there are poems being written from a masculine voice reminding us that we are connected to our mothers too. Somehow that feels helpful.
Yeah. And, you know, those statistics are so brutally sad and just so obvious to me. You know, I was very much raised in a way that was like, you look inside the traditional man's toolbox, and the one tool there is violence or anger, or sort of stoic, silent loneliness. So, you know, and then at some point, it's like I feel like some of these men are like cornered animals, where they know that the tools they have don't work, and the world doesn't work, and there's no honorable way back. Nobody gave them a different path to sort of self-actualization or new ways to think about their identity. And, you know, we have to start modeling different ways of being and interacting with the world and talking to your own emotion. I mean, in order to talk to your own emotions, you have to first acknowledge that they're real and worth paying attention to. And that's a pretty big hurdle for a lot of men, I think.
Yeah.
It's sad and dangerous and terrible. I mean,
yeah, it's almost, you know, akin to finding ways to regenerate soil, like find fertility again in these places that we've stripped so fucking bare.
Yeah.
You know,
and it's not unprecedented. You know, it's not through all history and cultures. It's perfectly clear that there are all sorts of historical precedents for a more thoughtful, caring, nurturing kinds of masculinity. I don't know. I think a lot of it comes down to role models. And I will say that I am encouraged from my time as a teacher and sort of the boys and men in my own life that I do feel like there are shifts happening. And I think there will be growing pains, but the smaller the world becomes, the more stories are disseminated. I think that for the people paying attention, I think we'll notice that things need to change. That's my hopeful statement about it.
Yeah, I'm hopeful as well. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just like wired to be hopeful. Like it's like,
Yeah.
I'm just gonna do that like obnoxiously, whether it makes sense or not. But
Well,
that's
sometimes that's a gift to you, that's not a bad thing either.
yeah. I mean, it's definitely a gift. Sometimes it's a kind of magical thinking, both in the healthy way and in the unhealthy way, I think. But that's definitely the cloak that I cast around myself to protect myself, I think.
Well, and at some point, it's a choice.
Yeah.
We don't know. It's not set. So, you push toward the world you want. And once you do that, I think there's no reason not to give yourself the gift, do yourself the kindness of saying that it's both worth doing and that your efforts in the world do something,
Yeah.
and that there are more people who care that don't. And I think that's a worthy thought.
You have poems about this choice.
Sounds right.
You're like, I do, probably. I was just reading one, but it's not in one of the ones I bookmarked. Oh, except it is, because I sent a bunch of them to that person I was talking about. I sent like 12 of your poems back to back in text today.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I was really, really moved and really having a day with it. Seriously, though, it's called If You Can Make Peace with the Unlikely Fact That Squids the size of school buses patrol the dark oceans at a depth that would crush you to paste, then I have faith you can also make peace with the unlikely fact that you are worthy of all the happiness you have imagined.
Both those things are true.
They're just both true.
Yeah. I had a poem, I think, called The Work that I was thinking of Many Hands. Let me read Many Hands real quick. It's on the subject. Many hands. The world will always be troubled. This is true. You deserve to feel happy and comfortable. This is also true. If you feel the first truth undermines the second, I offer this. Own a share of the virtuous work toward solutions. Don't burden your worth with global outcomes. The good and the evil are happening concurrently. The choice to focus on the good is itself a way to defy the evil.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So I was a scholar of Renaissance literature. And I mean, in the 17th century, everybody thought the world was ending all the time. So the people that I think went out are the people who then, took their child out to pick flowers, or the people who still got on with, making art and love and doing the things that come together to make a satisfying, worthy kind of life. Because I know, with environmental dread and political dread, and there's so many kinds of dread that really get its hooks into you. And then, in the internet especially, there are so many people who understand how sharp and clinging those hooks are and will use them to capitalize your attention. Yes. Whistleblowers at Facebook talking about how they always push the articles that get angry emotes because those are the ones that get more engagement. And I mean, there are forces at work to try to keep you angry and sad all the time. And so I think it takes an act of will to push back against that sometimes.
Yeah. And I think there's tremendous power, like you said, in the choice. Tremendous world-changing power. I really do.
Yeah. Yeah, me too.
I want to offer, if you feel like just saying, hi, you're here, it's a treat, it's real, there's real people, feel free to unmute and you can share any feedback or any questions.
No, I just wanted to say that your your poetry is beautiful, and I am buying your book on Amazon. So there
Aw.
you go.
Thanks, Mary. And
Welcome.
hello.
Hello.
Thanks, Mary. It's nice to hear your voice. It makes it feel more real than just seeing your name in a square.
So I just started snooping your Instagram, and I stumbled across a post that said, if you've ever grabbed a stick from the ground and thought, oh, this is a good stick, then we're family. So hello,
Yeah.
family.
Yeah.
Yes, we're kin. Exactly.
Well, thank you. I got a lot of comments on that post, like, do rocks count? I was like, yeah, rocks count. Of course, rocks count.
I also have a collection of good rocks.
Yeah.
Rocks just have a really slow metabolism.
Right.
True.
Oh, go ahead,
I
Jared.
keep buying at thrift stores. They make these bizarre things that are for displaying golf balls. I don't know if you've ever seen them. There's just like a grid of little shelves, and I keep finding them around here, and I've gotten like 3 of them, for $1 each, and I put them on my wall, and they've become where I store little tufts of moss or like a bird skull or a pebble, because it's like I can't just leave them around on tables. So I've attached them to the walls now so that I can keep expanding my collection of just little bits of nature that as soon as I saw them, I was like, oh, that's precious. I want to put that in my room. It's a cheap way to decorate too.
Yeah, I mean, in some of our language, we would call that altars to the things we love,
Oh.
Yeah.
I often find that I know precious little about sort of witchcraft more broadly, but I've had a number of kind sort of self-identifying witches tell me over the years, it's like, oh, what you're doing, we call this. Oh, cool. I feel like we dovetail really well. We
Yeah.
understand each other.
It does make me kind of glow to hear you say that you have an improvised form of ritual, or that you are making these assemblages of things that like resonate and make you feel the astonishing universe in your house. And like those are it's funny to like read your poetry and be like, that's a kindred spirit. And I was so nervous today to be like, I'm going to talk to a man on the podcast. It's so weird. Like I want to talk about masculinity and the complexities and all this stuff, and like I don't know if this is going to work. Like we talk about craft and magic and stuff, but it's really heartening to know that feeling was right.
Good. Yeah. I like to think I'm pretty easy. I'm happy to talk about anything. I don't know. It's interesting. You talking about an altar. It's funny. I look at all these little objects I have. I've got, beech nuts and pebbles and pine cones. And I often think of them as sort of stand-ins for broader concepts, right? And so that's also what words are. So that little shelf full of little bits of nature is kind of its own text too. And where I often use sort of the language of writing and writerly things as my stand-in for magical language too. And same with poems. I mean, I always told students back when I was a teacher years ago that like often I don't know what I think until I try to write it down. Until I pull it out of my mind and make it real by putting it in text. And then once it's text, I can have a conversation with it. But when it's still just sort of impulses shooting around my brain, it's too slippery. I can't interrogate it or really sort of look at it in the light of day and see if I really believe these things. So altars and rituals and taking ephemeral things and giving them a little slice of the real world to call their own, so that we can engage with them. I think all of that is fascinating and good.
Yeah, there's definitely a piece to making altars or doing ritual work or spell work that is very much like, I'm going to give this thing a symbol. I'm going to give it meaning, or look at the meaning that it has for me and then put it in assemblage with other meanings, like writing a text. And then I'm going to put them together in a container in a safe space together, and I'm going to protect them and pour energy on them. And for me, because I was a writer and a witch and didn't really know I was either of those things, I was just like sort of a lost person. Finding the language of both those things helped me understand the other, like they gave me the metaphor to understand the other in a way.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Does it? Yeah. Do you feel like you have a ritual practice to your writing in specific? Like, is there something material you do when you're sitting down?
It's almost the other way around for me. I will often feel called sort of, I share a fence with a cemetery, which is sort of a very thoughtful place. I always find it to be a very sweet place too. I mean, just sort of all of these remembrances of loved ones. And so most days I will walk around the cemetery, and then I have lots of tracts of wilderness near me, and I will walk around there. And so why I'm saying it's almost the reverse is that it's like I do the thing, and then the thought or the intention to write comes after. So I don't necessarily go out with the idea of coming up with something to say on the internet, but it's such a contemplative process of kind of going out and emptying my mind, to walk around any of these places that, to borrow language, feel sort of holy to me. And then I will often come to the writing after that. Not always. Sometimes I think to myself, I haven't posted in 3 days, and I'm going to sit down and write something because I'm a writer and I'm going to, make this happen. But at its best, it sort of happens organically when I'm sort of more in touch with nature.
Yeah, it sounds very much like how, I mean, I live on a lake, so I walk the circle of the lake. Walk the circle of the lake. and
Yeah.
then there's a kind of relationship that happens. Do you feel like you ever, I mean, in your podcast, there are hauntings, there are ghosts, there's creatures. You live next to a cemetery. Do you think are they in the novel? Are they haunting you? Are you writing channeled work?
Not, I don't think so. Not in that way. I mean, to me, I think about death constantly. It's just kind of one of my favorite things to think about. And I don't mean that in a grim way. It just is. And I often think of death as sort of coming back to sort of a wholeness. So it's sort of in my own inner landscape. I don't really picture ghosts. In the cemetery itself, nothing about it feels like an unquiet place to me. I don't know. The cemetery I live next to is a cemetery and arboretum. It feels like a place to me about the living and sort of about love and memory. I don't know. I find myself calling headstones memory stones to my 2-year-old. Says I have to call them something because to him it's an alphabet show place. So he just wants to go touch headstones and be like, hey, yeah, good job. At some point we'll have to come to terms with what it is, but and not hauntings. The podcast is interesting. So what happened was I left a job in academia 4 years ago, and I was sort of really on the edge of kind of an existential crisis. I didn't like the work I was doing. I was putting on a suit, and I was an administrator, and I was in budget meetings. And eventually, I was trying to find other jobs, and it was hard to find other jobs, and they were all the same sort of jobs. And I stepped into that because before I was an adjunct teacher, and what really wasn't a livable wage in teaching English and literature. And so, we made the math work with my partners just for me to leave. I don't know what's next, but it's not this. And so I kind of went into a little bit of a reclusive healing period where thankfully, it's such a privileged position to be in, but I was able to get sort of outside help, and I was able to be sort of sheltered for a time of healing. But so the podcast grew out of that, and it grew out of, all right, I need to stop. I've spent all of my time and energy writing things I don't particularly care about for other people. If I could write about anything I wanted, what would it be? And so I love fantasy as sort of a metaphor. I sort of love fiction as the idea that it's the truth inside the lies. Nature, I love odd nature, stories of the strange. So that all kind of came together and I love nature shows. I grew up with, Wild America and, David Attenborough, all these different nature shows. I just love shows of just a person talking about nature.
Yeah.
And so these all kind of came together into this hybrid creature that was a nature show about nature that didn't exist. But I've been a nature poet since I was 10. And so, it's more than just, I didn't want to do the X-Files. That's not what it was. It was sort of, I wanted to use fictional nature to, at its best, I like the idea of using fictional nature to remind people that real nature is exactly this strange and fascinating.
Yeah.
Because you forget, you see birds every day and you forget how mind-blowing, birds are. And so it's like, I want to write about nature that isn't real so that I can always guarantee I'm introducing somebody to something new. So, I don't write about Bigfoot. I write about always invented creatures because the point is the enthusiasm. And then it's me. So there's a poetry section in every episode. And it's caused this interesting, if I was a business person, I would say it's like a branding issue, right? Because it's like I have this one thing, this podcast that's sort of fantasy. And then all the other time I post sort of nature poetry. And then sometimes I post bad dad jokes. But it's just, I have found creatively that the most success I have ever had is when I just stop trying to imagine what an audience wants and start trying to be my truest self in my writing and what I produce. So I'm just trying to continue in that vein, and I'm not going to engineer whatever it is my brand is. I hate that word, but you know what I mean. I'm just going to continue to sort of try to be me, and people seem to get a sense of what that is, even though I feel like a lot of the things I put out are kind of all over the place.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I relate to that a lot. Oh, I also just interviewed Sophie Strand, the writer. She on Instagram, she's Cosmogony, an amazing fucking writer. And
Cool.
similar to you, she puts really long essays with every post. I mean, she's just pouring her words out, and she's had this like insane response. I mean, insane, glorious, emotional, understandable response of, just a big wave of followers. And I was talking to her about it, and she was like, honestly, I don't know what the fuck is happening to me. Like, I got a diagnosis that I was probably dying. And so I just started sharing everything, like as though these were my last chances to say whatever I wanted to say. And now I don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
To hear you say the same thing, you were in an existential crisis, like an emotional death, and just to say just whatever we need to say, just now's the time. It's the end of the world, or it's not, but
Yeah, well, and I don't know if it's just how I was raised, but there was so much artifice. Like, I don't know, it's high school and middle school and cliques and masculinity, and it was always this carefully crafted artifice that like, I don't know, I was in my 30s before it was like, maybe I need to start trying to figure out who I actually am, because I would realize I would speak differently depending on who I was speaking to. And it's like, well, yeah, I'm sort of a performative self, and that's not something you can just turn off. I mean, and talk about unexplainable sort of magical things. I think people really resonate with your work when you do find a way to be your truest self, because something about the human brain, there's just this innate sensor for when someone is trying to tell you what you want to hear or trying to act out a role. It's just earnestness and being genuine, or something that like we have a sixth sense for, I think. And I don't know, it was, I graduated from high school in 1999. And at the time it was just the thing that was so in vogue was irony, just sort of a layer of irony on everything. And so casting that off and being like, oh, no, I'm going to like the things I actually like and be enthusiastic about the things I'm actually enthusiastic about, and feel how I'm feeling, and not try to add a veneer of irony to it all. So, I mean, I think this is the process of being a living person. It's just kind of making mistakes and then figuring them out and healing from them and smushing it all together into an identity.
I usually ask towards the end of an episode, and I'm going to circle us towards that time as much as I want to just keep hanging out while our kids sleep and read poetry. And stuff. I always want to be respectful of your time and energy, and mine too, because I'm so electrified by these conversations, and then I just fall flat on my face after. Just like there's something about trying to be like so present and think out loud. Like I want to write everything down beforehand, and so just having to think out loud is so intense, right?
Yeah. So why am I so tired? I was just talking. But
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah, and you're like me, you live in the woods, so maybe you have a bit more opportunity than I do, it sounds like, but I just don't
No, I'm
see
used to
that many
quiet.
people.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know what you're saying. Yeah,
Yeah.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah. Anyway, that's like a detour, but usually towards the end of an episode, I do like to ask, is there a ritual you do that you can share? I think now, especially in the context of the conversation we've been having, is there something that helped you or helps you crack that irony or the constraints of a brand voice to find your real, what you really like, who you really are? Is there something you do? Yeah.
It's not a ritual, but I'm trying to, and I think a turning point for me in a lot of my mental health struggles was learning to, it goes back to the writing victory on the calendar and not the check mark, is learning to give the small things the same weight as the big things. I think we all have all of these narratives in our head of the hero journey and the big victory. And I think shrugging out of a lot of those expectations for yourself and starting to love, love that you made the effort to write something down, or love that you painted your nails, or that you brushed the dog, or sometimes that you got up and took a shower. And not because it's a mental health thing, but because those are actually the building blocks of life and actually deserve respect and being cherished. So I have something of a ritual where I will try at least once a day. And for a while it was meditation, sort of the kind of empty my mind and just experience the world kind of meditation. But I've added on the aspect of finding a way to extend gratitude sort of broadly to the world, into nature, but then also applaud something, a choice I made. And it can be, making a sandwich for my partner. I didn't have to do that. It can be sitting and making the concerted effort to write a poem with the idea that I'm going to try to touch somebody's life. It can be going out and working in the garden, any of those things, realizing and respecting that that was a choice. You didn't have to do it. And, you deserve to direct a little gratitude toward yourself in the way that you're exercising agency over the small things in your life. And then the jumping off point from there is that the small things are the big things. The ritual comes because you can think to yourself, oh, good idea. But unless you actually make time to do it, and I don't know what that is for the people listening, like it can be setting an alarm on your phone. It can be part of your bedtime ritual. Maybe there's a tablet on your nightstand that you write down your appreciation of yourself. But it happens because you make it happen. And I think making that happen, that self-gratitude, coupled with the broader gratitude, is really worth doing.
Yeah, that's a powerful one. That's kind of a figure eight shape to that gratitude. And then it relates back to so many things we've talked about, the tiny thing in me that is also the enormous thing everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you?
I have a going out on poem if you want.
That's
and
what
it ties into this.
That's what I want. Yeah.
Okay. I felt it coming here.
Yeah.
I pulled it up. So this one's called Unlearning Death. When we die, they may bury us or collect our ashes, but remember this: from baby teeth to skin cells and everything in between, most of the matter that has worn your name is already spread throughout the world. We bury our remains in the soil of our lifetimes. Can you feel it? So many of the cells that have formed the community of your body have returned to nature. Most of the water that has fueled your life has returned to the sea. The substance of your form is not fixed. It flows like a river to and from the wilderness. Moss doesn't think about being alive, and mountains don't consider themselves to be dead. Death has no place in the vocabulary of nature. To worry about death is to forget that we, the moss, the mountains, are all part of an undiminished whole that isn't measured in breaths.
Thanks, Jarod. Thanks, listeners.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. You can find Jarod's writing and poetry under the headline The Cryptonaturalist on all the social media places. Jarod, thank you so much. Thank you for facing that moment of existential crisis and choosing to be exactly who you are. It's meant a lot to a lot of us and will continue to do so. So I hope that when you walk through the cemetery, you see my face and all of our listeners thanking you and walking with you when you choose to send words out. They matter. They
Thank
are
you.
spells.
Thank you. I'm honestly honored. I can tell you have such a great community, and thank you for inviting me in to be a part of it tonight.
I feel really glad I did, and I was really nervous beforehand. It's awesome.
You must be a witch.
The Missing Witches podcast is brought to you by the Missing Witches Coven. Join us right now on patreon.com/missingwitches. Blessed fucking be.